As I said, Mike got most of this. I would only add in terms of the RAP introduction that what we mean by non-advocacy, nonpartisan is RAP is a group of veteran regulators that has existed for about 20 years, and we only have quiet conversations with regulators. We don't appear in their dockets, or we don't make comments. We didn't comment on the Clean Power Plan. Our goal is to just have those below-the-radar conversations that allow existing regulators to avoid making the same kind of mistakes that we made when we were regulators. RAP, as I said, has been about 22 years. Most of that was PUC regulators in its origins, but in the last 4 or 5 years they figured out that due to the overlap with energy policy and air quality policy that they should get a couple of veteran air regulators in. So I'm one of those airheads, having come from New Hampshire. This is an unusual presentation for me because for the most part I've been wallowing in 111D for a couple of years, so stepping back to craft the kind of remarks that Mike indicated was challenging, but I want to first provide some background information on what this is, where it came from, and some critical portions of the Clean Air Act that really drive the situation in front of us. I'll talk a little bit about how the Clean Power Plan is constructed. You will probably note throughout this that I'm a gross violator of don't use acronyms, that rule. So please assault me if I try to get one by you over the inside corner. Then I want to talk a little bit about issues and opportunities that I see in the plan. The industry context is also pretty critical because the power sector is not a stable entity itself at this point. And then I'll just close with some prognostications and recommendations. And I hope there's a timekeeper around because I don't have that operating. Excellent, thank you. The first question, of course, is why is EPA regulating carbon? And the answer to that is what motivates so much of EPA's behavior. They were sued and had to. That occurred in 2007. Massachusetts and some other states sued EPA to consider CO2 a pollutant harmful to human health and welfare, and Massachusetts prevailed in the Supreme Court. That was the threshold decision. What's important to note, though, is that since then, the courts have reviewed 3 important cases, and while EPA has had some wins and losses in each of those cases, never has the 2007 Mass versus EPA decision been threatened or challenged seriously. So essentially, the Supreme Court has had the opportunity not only to reverse its prior decision, but to do so multiple times, and it has not done so. So one ought to think, like it or not, that Mass versus EPA is the law of the land, and we need to get on with something. The key question is, what is that something? Well, it's not surprising that EPA would start with the power sector. The blue wedges that you see here, about 1/3 of U.S. emissions, are power plants. Some of that green is industrial, but when you take them together and look at all industrial greenhouse gas emissions, you can see that power plants overwhelmingly dwarf other sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So given that that pie represents millions of sources, because it includes vehicles, and that blue wedge, those blue wedges only represent, about 2,000 sources, maybe 3. It's a really logical place for EPA to start, and that explains it. In developing the Clean Power Plan, EPA called on Section 111D of the Clean Air Act. 111D was kind of an afterthought. The Clean Air Act regulates what are called criteria pollutants, things that you've heard throughout much of your life, ozone, particulate matter, and so forth. And then it also regulates toxic pollutants. But then the framers came to understand that there might be something in between, so they threw in this add-on afterthought just as the act was passing. And one of the provisions of that was to say, okay, well, we're not exactly sure how this will go or what they'll do, but do something similar to what Section 110 called for. And 110 is the highly prescriptive portion of the act which deals with criteria pollutants, which deals with ozone, particulate matter, and so forth. This is a critical distinction because 111D does not carry with it all of the prescriptiveness and therein lies the opportunity for flexibility with this plan. What is the proposed plan? Overall, the President's goal that the plan is supposed to accomplish is to reduce CO2 emissions from affected sources, power plants, 30% below 2005 levels. We're already halfway there, largely because of the move to gas due to low-price gas. In the plan, each state is given an emission performance goal or target rate. And that is based on a provision of the law, part of Section 111D, that says EPA has to determine those goals based on the best system of emission reduction. BSER is the code that's commonly kicked around for that. This is a highly laden term because what is system? Is it a bolt-on technology? Is it the whole power sector? And here's where a lot of the debates lie. Added to this is the fact that there's a cooperative federalism built into the Clean Air Act where EPA sets the target, determines the agenda, but states have the opportunity and authority to determine how they will respond and comply to that target. So each state, not EPA, will determine what its initial plan is. And then if a state does not do so or submits a deficient plan, then yes, EPA does have the authority to come in and do something on its own in the absence of adequate state action. What EPA did in building its BSER, the best system of emission reductions, was it assembled 4 building blocks. The first of those is heat rate improvements, or basically more efficient power plants, making existing plants more efficient in their operations. So optimizing them, one could do combined heat and power within the electric sector, that sort of action. This is the traditional kind of regulation that we're familiar with. EPA also added, though, switching from heavier carbon fuels to lighter carbon fuels, notably coal to gas. So fuel switching, retiring aging plants as a result. That was the second building block. Redispatches. Dispatch is the term used to sort the order in which power plants will be called on to meet demand. So redispatch is just changing the dispatch. Renewable and nuclear generation was the third building block, and that's pretty understandable. You're all familiar with PV, photovoltaic, and I even say acronyms, even when I don't display them. And of course, wind generation. And then the fourth building block was efficiency, and there's lots of flavors of that, of course. Energy efficiency itself, demand-side management programs that utilities usually do. Some states have an energy efficiency resource standard or performance requirement. Then there are behavioral programs, or appliance standards would qualify here, building codes, that sort of thing. EPA took all of that and created targets for each individual state. That was sort of like their algorithm. And this bridge chart illustrates Tennessee's. That 2015 is not the year. That's just coincidence of what EPA had for Tennessee's starting rate. And then you see building block 1 is the 113 there. And there are a couple of flavors of building block 2. Those are switching to natural gas and plants under construction. Building a couple of flavors of building block 3. It's step 4, but it's building block 3, the nuclear piece and the renewables piece, and then efficiency. That gets it all the way down to the goal, which is the 1163. Overall, this is about a 42% reduction for Tennessee. That's pretty serious, and Tennessee, reflecting that, is about the 13th most stringent state in the list, which ranges from 70% down to, I think, 20 or 20-ish, maybe even in the teens. I want to stop for a moment just to talk about some of the legal challenges because there isn't a good place to insert this, but it's important for you all to know that many states aren't wild about this proposal, and they are of the view, states and sources, coal companies, existing utilities with coal assets, and EPA is only ever regulated within the fence line. It's called at the power plant. And there's some question, because 111D was an afterthought, that EPA can't regulate outside the fence line. So that'll get litigated. A derivative of that is that Whatever EPA does for BSER can't include measures that are outside the fence line. So that will also be cited. Then there are some quirks in the law that suggest that because power plants are regulated for ozone and for toxics, they're already covered and can't be regulated for carbon. That'll be litigated. And then finally, folks suggest that this is really an energy regulatory effort, restructuring the energy system, and EPA isn't the energy regulator and shouldn't be doing this in the first place. So you'll see all of those kinds of things as this effort proceeds over the next several years. If it gets finalized, it'll be litigated the next day, and then we'll find out what happens from there. The important thing then, back to what is the Clean Power Plan, is that this is a real different animal. And a colleague and I just did a paper on this that I'd commend to you the links there, and I trust you all get the slides. But when the law said similar to 110, similar is not identical. And Section 111D has actually been so little used that it's referred to jokingly as the 40-year virgin. And that's because the Clean Air Act just turned 40 a couple of years ago. This has only been used, I think, twice, maybe 3 times before in pretty small end-of-pipe kind of circumstances. So there's very little state experience with Section 111D. In most of what the states do, or even what EPA does, cost and useful life, remaining useful life considerations are not front and center. Public health is. And then implementation is done after that, which considers cost. But in 111D, those things are front and center, and EPA has to take those into account, states do, in their plans. And there's not much of any track record there. How do you do that? What's a good one? What's a bad one? Nobody knows. What goes into those plans, the measures, the timing of them, the contents altogether, is also pretty uncharted water. Also unprecedented, basically, is the whole question of multi-state efforts. The Clean Air Act authorized the creation of the Northeast Ozone Transport Region. When ozone was thought to just go up the coast, it turns out it's bigger and broader than that. There's also a Western Regional Air Partnership, though I'm not sure that was cited. I don't think that was cited in the Act. But basically, there's really few circumstances where states have worked together on air pollution issues. Now, there's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a voluntary state-by-state effort. It turns out that's provided some good precedent in terms of ease of implementation and enforcement, and might be approved by EPA as a compliance plan of those states. Then finally, there's clearly no precedent, given the little precedent above, for federal swooping in to fix whatever states didn't do or did wrong. So all of this is pretty uncharted. Now, the difference between Section 111D and 110 really plays heavily here, because state air directors have been using Section 110 for their entire lives, in fact, 2 generations of air directors. So they would be one might assume, to use Section 110 thinking as they approach their Section 111D, the Clean Power Plan compliance obligations. If they do so, however, they will not be using the flexibilities that 111D allows. And as a result, they may face less innovation, higher costs, and fewer options. I analogize it to, I'm a financial advisor, and I can suggest that you buy bonds, and you'll be safe. EPA will approve it if you approach it as a 110 kind of a method. But you won't have the flexibility, you won't have the variety of options and so forth. Whereas you could go to the equities market and have lots of flexibility and options, but yes, there's also more risk about whether EPA will approve whatever it is you decide to do in this stock market. So keep that analogy in mind. Among the uncharted elements, the unprecedented elements, is the fact that when the rule goes final, which we anticipate to be July, that really hits a reset button. You know, BSER is used to set the target, period. And then it essentially goes away. The states get that target and a clean sheet of paper, and EPA says, go write your plan. EPA itself moves into receiving the plans mode and approving them, and that'll be a lengthy and serious dialogue between the agency, the regional offices of the agency, and the states. And then again, if they're deficient, then EPA will have to swoop in. All of this is unknown. All of it's uncharted waters. One thing we do know is that the states get first crack, as I indicated, at developing their plans, but given that there's so little structure provided in 111D, and from that lack of structure derives the flexibility, it might also be possible to have too much flexibility. You know, what do you do when you have too many options? Like a kid in the candy store, right? And this is where it's tricky for states because they want some advice. I'm sorry, I should have elaborated. This is Alphonse and Gaston. After you? No, I insist, sir. After you? No, please, after you. Well, that's kind of the situation with EPA in the states. What do you want us to do? Whatever you think best. Well, could you give us some direction, please? Well, why don't you think of something innovative? You know, this is not good guidance for states. But EPA has been litigated over prescribing things for states to do when states have the right to submit the plans originally, and lost. So EPA is not going to do anything or say anything about what states can or can't do. Don't look for advice is what the short answer is. It's not because they're being mean, it's just because they know that they'll get litigated on a fifth point and have lost that one in prior circumstances. So about that flexibility, we started with these building blocks, but it turns out they're not the only options. There are many other options than just those 4 building blocks. One can optimize grid operations. There's lots of things that you can do with voltage regulation and reactive power, how the power is consumed and adjusting for it. Line losses in the transmission and distribution system can be as high as 20% at peaks. They normally run 6 or 7%. You know, at those levels, 10, 20%, you can be running 5 power plants to deliver the useful work of 4. So this is an area to focus on. Privately delivered energy efficiency, we're all pretty familiar with utility-sponsored programs, but there's a lot of efficiency going out there, particularly in what they call the MUSH market, the municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals. So that's an arena that is hardly tapped for regulatory purposes because it's not under any regulatory supervision. It's just businesses improving their operations. Lots of other things that one could do. One could dispatch based on environmental attributes instead of economics, improve long-term planning. You could do something like the RGGI program. You could even do a carbon tax. A state could implement a carbon tax. Just indicative of the flexibility, a year ago, the Assistant Administrator for Air at EPA, Janet McCabe, was asked, what about water? Could water conservation measures be construed as a 111D measure? And that's a reasonable question. In California, water production, extraction, transportation, and treatment after it's used, is 19% of their electrical load. Every 5th power plant is dedicated to water in California. So some water conservation could be really useful. Janet McCabe said yes. So this is really a situation where we can think outside the box. The National Association of Clean Air Agencies, this is the largest organization of state air directors in the country, has been preparing what they call a menu of options. It was even started before the rule was proposed, and it includes 10 chapters on technology options and another 15 or so on policy options, and they were the kinds of things we were just running through. That's supposed to be released next week, I think. We've been helping with it, but it's their document, so they get to release it. So when it comes to state clean power plan and the compliance with them, the conventional wisdom has been, and I hope that you haven't all had this experience, but I imagine that any of you who know anything about 111D probably have had this focus, is on these 4 building blocks. And the conventional wisdom is that you'll use some or all of each of those building blocks. Probably none of them will be 0, and you'll see what you can do and mash those together to reach EPA's target. The reality is that the real opportunity is that there's all this stuff outside of those building blocks. And that indeed, some of EPA's building blocks may be zero, depending on what you choose to do in the state. So think outside the building block box, and to paraphrase, better to seek forgiveness than ask permission. Better to seek approval than ask permission. States should target what they want to do. So as an example, if Tennessee is concerned about some of its coal plants, or TVA is, that's building block 1, the 113. One could get some of those reductions instead from energy efficiency. That energy efficiency number represents EPA moving Tennessee from about, I think it's 0.28% of retail sales a year. The best states are about 2%. EPA is shooting at 1.5%. So you could get another 50 or so here easily, if not the full 272 total. And that would take the heat off some of those power plants. So you can play this chess game of shifting the weights around. In doing that, one should keep some other things in mind as well. This 2x2 matrix, I appreciate the Pasteur analogy, because 2x2 matrices may be the most useful thing mankind's invented, I think. This one, the vertical axis is air quality benefits, high or low, benefit or detriment. And the horizontal axis is the same for climate, benefits on the right, detriments on the left. And it turns out that there's a lot of things you can do in air quality that hurt climate, that increase greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a lot of things you can do on the greenhouse gas emissions side that hurt air quality. Diesels is one in the lower left. Do I have a pointer? Yep. Down, I don't know if you can see down in here, those things operate well with respect to greenhouse gases, but they may increase particulates or NOx for nitrogen oxides, which contributes to ozone. These things up in the upper left, scrubbers, great idea for conventional pollutants reducing particulates, but they also require energy, which means there's an energy penalty being paid, which means there's more greenhouse gases being emitted. So that's bad for climate. So where you want to be is in that upper right that's best for both. And that's efficiency and combined heat and power, renewables, carbon capture and sequestration when that comes aboard. The point is that good 111D choices can help your air quality picture, and good air quality choices can help your 111D picture. I mentioned water before, but note most of those things in the upper right also don't require water, as does steam electric generation, conventional generation as we know it. These things can be integrated together. RAP has also done a little work on that, and there's another paper you could look at. Why is this important? Well, here's one example. EPA is even now considering, as is required under the Clean Air Act, possible revision to the ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standard, the standard of ozone in the air that states have to meet. And Tennessee has a couple of ozone non-attainment areas. EPA's Scientific Advisory Committee has advised that the standard be reduced from 75 parts per billion down to between 60 and 70. And the gray dots you see on this map are those between 60 and 75. In other words, from the Clean Air Act Advisory Committee's, Science Advisory Committee's low bound up to the current level, and the yellows and blues and reds are non-attainment areas. Well, the gray areas you can just make out in Tennessee would probably double or triple the number of non-attainment areas in Tennessee. And nobody wants that, least of all governors, because non-attainment carries with it economic development sanctions. Basically, new sources have to leave the air cleaner than they found it for non-attainment pollutants, which is pretty tricky. I mentioned privately delivered energy efficiency, just to take that as an example for a moment. ESCOs is energy service companies. They are the folks who are in this market providing those services. And you can see that compared to utility programs, the blue wedge, they're about the same size. This is investment that doesn't require any tax or utility ratepayer investments. It's all voluntarily assumed. It's about $7 billion, expected to continue growing, because one of the real advances in our economy since and even during the recession is efficiency. Emissions are down not only because of gas, but because we've gotten far more efficient in our devices and technologies. This is all scalable for 111D, but it's totally foreign to air directors. Air directors haven't been used to, don't have necessarily a vehicle for incorporating privately delivered energy efficiency emission reductions, the reductions associated with that efficiency, in any kind of regulatory program. So it's tricky, but it's there, it's free, it's being done, let's use it. Efficiency won't be easy because EPA has made it so hard, again sticking mentally to that Section 110 criteria. EPA, one of the biggest problems facing us is that EPA needs to itself get outside that box. Here's an example. We say apply a mobile source analogy. Many of you may recognize these catwalks on this power plant stack. That's where the emissions monitoring gear is held. There are probes that go into the stack and measure pollutant emission concentrations. What EPA does, these plants are required to do by EPA is to measure those emissions, and then those go into their clean air plans, traditionally SIPs. Now, energy efficiency is millions of little devices, but because they're energy, EPA has still traditionally thought, well, measure them, and then you can work them into air quality plans. But at the same time, EPA has another arena where they have millions of small sources. They're called cars. And it analyzes their emissions through bench tests and assumptions and penetrations and fleet calculations and allows those emissions to be counted in air quality plans. All we're asking is to make that change and bring the same kind of statistical ease and generalization to the millions of small sources that are called energy efficiency. There are a couple other ways that EPA could also streamline calculating emissions reductions associated with energy efficiency. We're open to those. We've suggested those as well. But if EPA does not do this, then state air directors and others will be less inclined to use efficiency, which means we'll have more multiple emissions, less savings, because efficiency is the cheapest. The water won't be saved, the other emissions. It simply will be a suboptimal solution. Speaking of suboptimal, 111D provides a great opportunity for states to work together. As I said, there's little precedent on that, but these are electricity reliability areas. Maybe it makes sense for states to collaborate within those areas to help ensure reliability and emission reductions. Larger market areas, of course, yield lower costs, so there's another reason. And one of the hesitations is, do we have to be all in economy-wide? And the answer to that, we believe, is no. The Western states have done a lot of work recently on modular approaches. So the states could get together for the purposes of the renewable energy block, or they could get together for some or all kinds of energy efficiency programs and measures. They needn't be in for everything. So that's a good way to go. Renewable tracking is already well underway. It's important, of course, not to double count, and that's pretty tricky with efficiency. The power plant that backs down because you did some efficiency may be in another state. How do you regulate that? So this is all tricky, but the tracking systems work now for renewable energy, RECs, renewable energy certificates. Efforts are even now in development by the software folks who have built that and the managers who run the various programs across the country to include energy efficiency in the same form. Registering certificates are serialized. They get retired when they're used, so there's no double counting. That can be done. Federal enforceability has been an issue. There's been claims that EPA wants to come in and take over your state energy efficiency and other programs. Could EPA do that? Would they? Have they? Maybe they could. No, they haven't, and no, they wouldn't. It's the last thing EPA wants to do. What would actually occur? EPA would determine that a state is deficient, would have long conversations with it, hoping that it amends its ways, gives them the opportunity to correct that situation, and only if they devoutly refuse would EPA implement a federal plan. It wouldn't come in and take over your plans, it would implement its plan. A good example of this is the 20-year Boston Harbor cleanup, right? That was another short window, and EPA kept coming back saying to Massachusetts, how you doing? but it never said, okay, it's taken you guys 10 years, we're going to take over. And that, by the way, that provision I just suggested, the deficiency and implement the plan, that's all under 110. And 111, we just said, was more liberal, more flexible. So presumably EPA could even be less apt to intervene under 111D. In terms of industrial context, this is really important because the power sector is certainly not in a vacuum at this point. It has fundamental changes that are afflicting and affecting it. I don't know as you can read this because it's pretty light, because I pilfered it directly out of a report that Utility Dive did. They surveyed 400 utility, 425 utility executives. I think they were self-selecting, so I don't know how that group was assembled, but 400 is a pretty good number anyway, and asked several questions. Among those questions were, what are the top 3 emerging technologies that you think your utility should invest in? Energy storage, energy efficiency, utility scale renewables, distributed generation, demand response. These are all the things I was talking about when I said renewables and efficiency. So the utilities are thinking the same thing. Another question they were asked is, what do you think your utility's business model will be in 20 years? And the dark bar at the top is the traditional vertically integrated utility. The orange bars are where those utility executives think they're headed. And the second one there is energy services utility, smart integrator, and then just deregulated distribution utility. This is kind of where New York has just headed recently at their Public Service Commission. So you can see even the utility folks think their business models are going to change markedly in the near future. Well, what new business models are you guys thinking about? Energy efficiency, demand response, information services, distributed generation, and the platform again. Not business as usual at all. And the one that was most shocking to me, one of the questions was about the Clean Power Plan. And how should EPA move ahead with it? And 34% of those utility executives said, steady as she goes. Stick with your guns, EPA. But the amazing thing was that 28% said they should make emissions targets more stringent, more aggressive, and the timetables to accomplish them. So nearly 2/3 of utility executives said do it or do it better. This is shocking. And what it says to me is that officials may want to exercise caution in positioning their states against these industry trends. As if that weren't enough, let's look at what the markets are saying. This is UBS, one of the major investment houses, and the head of their utility or energy practice does periodic articles. This one you can't read, of course, so I excerpted from it. And one piece there is that, yes, a lot of folks have been fearing this, but we, UBS, see it as legally binding under Massachusetts versus EPA. They say that coal retirements will come from other EPA regs and the fact that dispatching coal plants doesn't compensate for their higher fixed costs, and there's less investment due to the weaker economics for coal, not the Clean Power Plan directly. And interestingly, utilities make most of their money on their rate-based assets, their capital assets. And UBS says that we see the next wave of capital expenditures as being driven by carbon emissions. Utilities are going to invest to achieve these reductions. So that's what their next path for making money. And indeed, UBS says diligent management teams will get in front of their regulators with their plans to comply with this EPP. They'll see their capital expenditures ramping up faster. And then my favorite, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That's from the market. You know, that's not from the NRDC or EDF or something. Well, then into the prognostication section. What will the federal plan look like? Well, of course, nobody knows. But one thing is clear, the states will relinquish their first crack rights. EPA will be freed from the building blocks. As I said, the states get a target. EPA can then go and implement that target its own way. It doesn't have to follow its 4 building blocks. That's just the algorithm it used to get the number. EPA is unlikely to do a different plan for every state. You know, so it would probably develop and administer one plan that applies to all the states that are reluctant. Might that be a mass-based cap and trade program? That's what EPA's used to with the sulfur trading program, with the Northeast NOx budget trading program. They've even been accused of wanting to do this nationally, so at least it's a logical surmise it could be that. What's interesting, of course, then, is just say no could help EPA get to that endpoint. I'm not sure that's the usual intent for folks who are doing just say no, but it's something to think about. And then in July, what will the final plan look like? Well, of course, this is all a crapshoot because nobody knows. But the question of will there be different state targets, I think there certainly will. There were several errors. You know, states that had major plants down for 2012, the baseline year. Other situations where the high hydro years, so emissions were lower in the Northwest, that kind of thing. I think EPA will take that into account. And we're apt to see markedly different state targets in a number of cases. I expect the overall target will remain the same because EPA's boss, the president, asked for that. There was, EPA is always in a situation where it sets a target and a deadline that somebody can wait until the last minute and then it can't be done, then what can EPA do at the last minute? So they usually prescribe a glide path as well, and EPA did so with the Clean Power Plan. It turns out that that glide path is more like a drop-off, at least for a lot of states. And indeed, it will be harder for those states to comply on the front end, 2020, 2022, so forth, than it will for them to comply with 2030. So EPA will revise that. It's my expectation. The interim goal and the glide path will be gentler. Now, that may be tricky because they're interested in the overall reductions, not just hitting the end target. So we'll see what it looks like. EPA tried to keep nuclear units operating, but the way it did it confused everybody. And in doing so, it even introduced obligations that seemed counterproductive. So I expect EPA will do something with respect to nuclear units that is different, but I don't know what, hopefully constructive. They might provide a multi-year baseline instead of just 2012. Maybe the case that states can choose, or it may have a 3-year window. Most regulations are built that way. I expect significantly different treatments of renewables and efficiency. Interestingly, the baseline numbers were built on what states generate for renewables, but then EPA said that compliance could follow who buys them. So you got tagged for your responsibility based on what you generated, but somebody else owns what you generated, so you can't count it. That's kind of apples and oranges. So I expect they'll do something different with that. Energy efficiency also had lots of opportunities to get orphaned. A state like Washington, where it's done lots of efficiency and as a result does little fossil generation, most of that's scheduled for shutdown, can only take credit for efficiency up to the amount of their fossil generation. Well, that's a minority of what they've actually done. So I expect EPA, if it wants to encourage efficiency, will make some amendments there as well. And then finally, the question of a safety valve. There's been a lot of noise about, is a safety valve necessary for reliability? I don't know, but I know it's not a binary thing, and EPA should have some kind of sliding scale such that if the lights are actually going out, yes, generators can run. And EPA would want to do that too. So I think there'll be a safety valve in. I also think it's highly unlikely that it'll be used. One key point is don't expect all the questions to be answered. You know, this is the president's legacy. It's on a tight time frame, even a political time frame. So it will get done. It has just never been done before. So it won't be complete. It won't answer all the questions. There'll still be plenty of confusion and plenty of litigation. Key takeaways then with respect to state plans, and I'm delighted my timer just said 20 minutes left, so we'll have time for Q&A. I hope to get through in this kind of time frame, so hooray. Most important is recognize that Section 111D of the Clean Power Plan is not a traditional SIP. You can think outside the box, and it's going to take work to do that because everybody only ever has thought inside the box. So we all run the risk of not even knowing we're thinking inside the box and trying to think outside the box. This will be tricky. Think outside, I just said. Think integrated. I talked about air quality and climate, water and climate. There's also risk elements, right? The more you can do through efficiency, the less water, fuel, and infrastructure risks that you also face and have to account for. So think in terms of integration in your approach. I would suggest at least exploring regional approaches. They do offer potential cost savings, and there's always strength in numbers, particularly when dealing with EPA. And then least cost, least risk. Nobody is out there charged with ensuring that clean power plant compliance occurs at least cost. You know, if I'm an air director and I do what I've always done, it will not be least cost. In fact, efficiency may be hard. Measuring the energy savings of efficiency, that's megawatt hours, kilowatt hours, is hard enough. And I've never done any of that stuff as an air director, so I'm going to have to run screaming from the room. People talk about net versus gross and EM and V and free riders. I'm out of there. I don't know what you're talking about. And that's only half of it, because that's what you save for energy. Now, how much did that represent in terms of emissions reductions? There's a whole conversion there that's also tricky. That depends on what was the marginal plant and what was the time of day, and did it occur in-state or out-of-state. I don't know any of that stuff either, and now I'm really running screaming from the room. I know how to solve this problem. I know how to permit another gas plant. Right? Wrong answer if least cost is your goal. Wrong answer if long-term climate benefit is your goal. So this is going to be hard. The bottom line then is, don't ask what EPA wants your plan to be, because they don't have the answers either. And they won't tell you because they don't want to get sued for telling you what to do. Ask what you want your state's plan to be. Talk to your regulators, talk to the folks involved, talk to your companies, talk to your advocates, and see if you can point everybody in that direction. That's my intro, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And I'd be glad to try to address any questions you may have.